Today we're diving into an exciting new way to think about dynamic scenes, 4D Gaussian splatting. Instead of just modeling motion indirectly or tracking individual 3D objects, this method uses 4D Gaussian shapes to capture how a scene changes over space and time. What's cool is that it doesn't rely on making heavy assumptions about motion. We'll explore how this approach works and why it's a game changer for representing the dynamic world around us. Let's get started.
Let's begin by looking at why dynamic 3D scenes are so important for AR, VR, and metaverse applications. The main challenge is to capture real-world scenes and their motion over time without restricting how they move or transform. In this work, we approach it by learning a single spatio-temporal 4D volume. That means we treat space and time together instead of handling them separately. To do that, we introduce something called 4D Gaussian Splatting. Essentially, we represent everything with 4D Gaussians that are parameterized as ellipsoids. These ellipsoids can move and rotate freely in space and time, covering both geometry and appearance changes. And by using spherical harmonics, we can adapt how things look from different viewing angles and under different lighting conditions as time passes. A big takeaway is that we use very few assumptions, making the framework flexible for a variety of dynamic scenarios. Our visuals show how the method converts entire dynamic scenes into planar Gaussians for high-quality rendering and efficient computation. We consider this a solid approach for modeling complex scene dynamics. Now, let's talk about what makes these dynamic scenes so tricky. They're changing across both time and space, and we need to keep track of how one part of the scene relates to another in different moments. Traditional 3D scene modeling methods, like NERF, are great for static scenes, but stumble when things start moving. There are also older approaches for dynamic scenes. Some try to directly learn a function describing space and time, but risk muddling different motions. Others attempt to model motion explicitly, but run into problems if parts of the scene appear or disappear. Our approach doesn't assume a particular motion model. Instead, we treat the scene as a four-dimensional volume, allowing a lot of flexibility. 4D Gaussian splatting with ellipsoids captures how objects evolve over time and space, while spherical harmonics take care of appearance changes from different viewpoints. This design aims for both precision and efficiency in dynamic scene learning. Let's outline the three key contributions. First, we redefine dynamic scenes as 4D spatiotemporal volumes, with minimal assumptions about how motion works. Second, we develop 4D Gaussian primitives in the form of anisotropic ellipses to model both geometry and appearance. Spherical harmonics help with any view-dependent color shifts. Third, experiments show better visual quality and efficiency than other methods on a variety of tasks, such as creating new views of a scene and helping with scene understanding. We also tackle how to reduce the large size of this 4D representation. We look into compression, removing redundant parameters, and other ways to make the model more compact. We cover recent improvements in dynamic 3D scene modeling, discussing how some approaches adjust representations over each frame or optimize geometry through more efficient methods. The goal is to make dynamic scene modeling more scalable and practical for real-world scenarios. Let's step back and see where 4D Gaussian splatting fits in with recent progress on novel view synthesis. For static scenes, we've come a long way since NERF. NERF and its offshoots have boosted rendering quality and geometry accuracy, but still struggle when objects move around. That's where 3D Gaussian splatting made a breakthrough, combining real-time rendering with volume-based representations. When scenes are dynamic, it's tough to keep everything consistent over time. Some NERF-style techniques try to split dynamic from static parts or rely on extra self-supervision. It's particularly useful for driving scenes, where there's constant movement and a lot of sensor data to incorporate. Some methods rebuild the scene from depth maps, others ditch bounding boxes. Meanwhile, 3D and 4D content generation is gaining traction, letting us simulate realistic motions and reconstruct scenes even in challenging conditions. These emerging techniques fill the gaps in fidelity and scalability for tasks involving dynamic scenes. So how does our 4D Gaussian splatting framework actually work? It basically takes a dynamic scene and splits it into 4D Gaussians. Each Gaussian covers both space and time. We treat the space part as a 3D Gaussian and the time part as a 1D Gaussian. Next, we handle view-dependent coloring so the scene's appearance lines up with the viewer's perspective at each moment. We rely on spherical harmonics to capture complex lighting and color variations. Finally, we project everything into 2D to create the rendered image. Want to see it in action? Look at figure 2 here. It shows how a single 4D Gaussian evolves through time and how it turns into planar Gaussians for rendering. This modular design gives us efficient handling of dynamic scenes while preserving impressive visual fidelity. Before we get to the 4D part, we start with the basics of 3D Gaussian splatting. These 3D Gaussians are anisotropic, which means they can stretch differently in different directions. They have parameters for position, size, rotation, and color. This is how we represent static 3D scenes. Then we dive into how the mean position and the spread of a 3D Gaussian are mathematically defined, and how they get optimized through a rendering process. During optimization, we sharpen the density and arrangement of Gaussians, removing any that don't contribute much and refining the ones that do. Because the rasterization is differentiable, the colors of these Gaussians can adapt to specific camera viewpoints. By projecting 3D information into 2Ds, we achieve real-time rendering with realistic shading and smooth transitions. This lays the groundwork for extending to dynamic scenes. Now let's see how we blend these 3D Gaussians into a final 2D image. Each Gaussian influences the pixel color based on depth, size, opacity, and visibility. The transformation from 3D to 2D is done through perspective projection, which keeps the important properties of each Gaussian but flattens them for rendering. After covering 3D blending, we move on to 4D Gaussians. The covariance matrix becomes a 4D structure that handles both time and space. In Rangfa, it includes scaling and rotations in 4Ds, often parameterized with quaternions. With these elements, our 4D Gaussians know how to change over time, providing a coherent and optimized way to represent dynamic scenes. So how do we incorporate time into pixel generation? We treat the probability that a Gaussian contributes to a pixel's color as having two parts, one for spatial conditions and one for temporal changes. This separation helps a single Gaussian account for motion over time without losing track of where it is in space. We use Gaussian distributions for both the spatial and temporal probabilities. Spatial dictates which pixel gets influenced, while temporal tells us how the Gaussian shifts or changes over time. Combining these factors lets us model motion accurately. This section also provides a quick proof showing how unnormalized Gaussian functions can be factorized into these spatial and temporal pieces. This factorization makes our rendering pipeline more manageable and sets us up for efficient scaling. Let's talk training. The 4D Gaussian splatting model is trained end-to-end across entire videos, which avoids the hassle and inefficiency of a frame-by-frame approach. We focus on two things: optimization and density control. First, we use the rendering loss as our main supervision. Intense. In dynamic scenes with lots of motion, you might expect flickering if the sampling is off. Instead of piling on extra constraints, we find that batch sampling works well to keep things smooth and realistic. Second, density control ensures we don't over or underrepresent details that shift over time. We track position gradients and apply spatial and temporal sampling to keep each Gaussian properly balanced in the scene. Another challenge is when the same point in the scene is covered by multiple Gaussians over time. That can lead to redundancy. To address this, we introduce a 4D spherical harmonics framework that describes how appearance evolves in time and across viewing directions. It uses spherical coordinates and time intervals, and is inspired by principles from auditory modeling. A Fourier series keeps computations simpler, offering an efficient representation. We also tackle memory demands. Complex view-dependent attributes can bloat memory usage, so we turn to residual vector quantizations. This compresses color and shape properties, so we maintain high-quality rendering without blowing up our memory budget. Let's move on to two big advancements. First, we want to remove Gaussians that don't really matter for the final image. We do this by scoring each Gaussian during training. Anything with a low score gets masked out, which trims down the computational load. There's also a custom loss function making sure we apply this masking properly. Second, we adapt the 4D Gaussian splatting model to challenging urban environments. Urban scenes usually come with sparse data and limited camera angles. We use a learnable cube map for the sky to handle the visual gap between sky and ground. On top of that, we apply extra regularization for sparse data to keep the motion consistent, even when we have fewer observations of certain parts of the scene. Here, we introduce structured compression and optimization for 4D Gaussian splatting in dynamic environments. We start with anchor points that spawn 4D Gaussians during rendering. These anchors carry learned features like location and context, and then create offsets on the fly. This cuts down on redundant Gaussians and lets us better handle motion by leveraging shared structures in the scene. We also add a warm-up step for optimizing static areas while aligning motion representations using dual quaternion methods. Rigid loss terms help ensure that Gaussians nearby each other move in a consistent way, and if there's LiDAR depth data, that further improves how well everything lines up with reality. Finally, there's an integrated loss function to juggle multiple goals: accurate motion, correct depth, minimal clutter, and realistic sky rendering in urban settings. Next up, video to 4D generation. The idea is to start from a single view video and create a 4D object that can be viewed from any perspective at any time. We begin by using a diffusion model to make pseudo-views for each frame, which broadens our training data. Each Gaussian gets assigned its own feature vector for multi-scale details, managed through a scale-gated mapping. During training, there's a contrastive learning mechanism that aligns features when they're supposed to be similar and separates them otherwise. This multi-granularity segmentation helps the method handle really complicated visual scenarios, giving us more reliable reconstructions when viewpoint or time changes. Building on that, we incorporate semantic scene understanding into 4D Gaussian splatting. To do segmentation, we inject scale-gated feature vectors into each Gaussian. Then, using contrastive learning and existing segmentation masks, we teach the system how to group or differentiate features. The paper tests this on datasets like planoptic video, which involves real-world scenes, and DNERF, which is synthetic and covers dynamic views with limited camera angles. These datasets let us evaluate how well the segmentation strategy works in both realistic and more controlled situations. Now for some comparative results. We test our 4D Gaussian splatting model against other advanced methods on real and synthetic data. In the planoptic video dataset, check out the table for metrics like PSNR or perceptual similarity. 4D Gaussian splatting scores well for both visual accuracy and speed. On DNERF, which focuses on dynamic monocular scenes, 4D Gaussian splatting again achieves strong scores like PSNR and structural similarity. We also have ablation studies. They examine the importance of components like coupling space and time in a single framework. These tests confirm the value of using 4D splatting and also show how well the model adapts to different lighting or surface conditions. Continuing with the results, we see that for real-world datasets like planoptic video, we initialize 4D Gaussian distributions with extra points to better handle the background. The dynamic view synthesis results show that our model achieves real-time speeds without sacrificing rendering quality. Even on synthetic data, where some methods rely on handcrafted priors, our approach does well without those constraints. The ablation studies focus on how we integrate space and time in the variance matrix. The findings underscore that including both spatial and temporal dimensions in a unified representation improves the overall clarity of the scene and keeps computation in check. Here we compare our 4D Gaussian model with existing methods in more visual detail. If you look at figure 3, you'll see examples like flame guns and moving hands. The 4D Gaussian approach handles these motions with clarity, keeping a solid frame rate. Figure 4 shows how the model deals with different time slices, with a comparison between the full version and one that lacks certain 4D rotations. It demonstrates how the temporal coherence relies on having that full 4D rotation capability. We also see that if there isn't enough supervision or regularization, the scene's dynamics can become coarse or blurry. This highlights the need for smooth transitions across both space and time to maintain a clear, dynamic rendering. This part points out why the unconstrained 4D Gaussian approach is advantageous. When we compare constrained versus unconstrained settings, the unconstrained version works better for dynamic motion and temporal coherence. For example, Ignoring 4D rotations can mess up fast-moving parts like a wheel rim. Being able to distribute Gaussians in time helps us distinguish dynamic objects from the static background, so we can efficiently apply background Gaussians. We also use marginal probabilities to filter out unneeded Gaussians, keeping rendering speeds stable even for longer videos. An ablation study shows that including spatio-temporal evolution boosts quality for scenes with complex motion. Next, let's look at the dynamic visual results, especially optical flows and rendered images from planoptic video sequences like cooked spinach or flame salmon. Comparing our rendered flows to the ground truth, we see that the 4D Gaussian framework captures subtle movements of both objects and the background. Check out Figure 2 if you want to see how these flows line up visually. This underscores the framework's ability to handle nuanced transitions and object interactions without producing flickering or strange artifacts. It's all about ensuring the rendered images keep in step with the real motion. We also have experiments on compressing Gaussian attributes in the 4D framework. First, there's temporal densification, which lets Gaussians shift and adapt over time. This approach smooths things out both in space and time. Then we look at attribute compression. We encode parameters like scaling and opacity using vector quantization, applying thresholds to prune unimportant details. We use codebooks for scaling, and opacity gets fine-tuned with quantization-aware training. These measures help keep the computational load in check. We tested these ideas on a sequence called cut roasted beef to see how well they preserve quality while reducing overhead. Here, the focus is on how parameter compression impacts storage and performance. We systematically try quantization, fine-tuning, and different encoding methods for attributes like scaling, position, opacity, and color. We observe how each step reduces memory usage while watching out for any dips in performance metrics like image similarity. For instance, going to 8-bit quantization really helps lower storage, and a bit of fine-tuning can bump the performance back up. There are graphical comparisons that show how the rendering quality remains high, even as we aggressively compress our parameters. The goal is to strike a balance between saving memory and keeping the visuals solid. We continue discussing how compression and pruning can trim the size of the 4D Gaussian representation without hurting the final render too much. Reducing memory for scaling and rotation alone can yield a 3.5 times drop in storage, with only a minor quality decrease. Quantization plus fine-tuning goes even further, cutting back on space while recovering any minor losses in clarity. Pruning knocks out Gaussians that aren't contributing much. Setting a threshold for pruning can remove a big chunk of them. This also helps get rid of floating artifacts that might appear. Even after pruning, the similarity scores stay roughly the same or improve, suggesting that those removed Gaussians weren't really necessary. Now we turn to performance evaluations using structured 4D Gaussians. Ablation studies tell us that these structured versions produce better visuals and better numerical metrics, such as image similarity, in complicated scenes like bouncing balls or Lego. We also apply the model to dynamic urban scenes. Thanks to features like structured Gaussian models and refinement steps, we come out ahead in scene reconstruction and novel view generation. The metrics confirm that we can handle fast-changing details and different camera views in urban settings effectively. We dig a bit deeper into how structured 4D Gaussians reduce redundancies and improve rendering for dynamic scenes. By introducing a structured approach, we significantly cut down the number of primitives, but actually improve the rendering quality. Then we see how urban scenes benefit from calibrated cameras and point clouds. Our unified 4D Gaussian approach outperforms competitors when it comes to both static and moving elements. Ablation studies also emphasize the benefits of multi-frame supervision and sparse motion constraints for these complex road and cityscapes. That means better reconstruction and more reliable rendering under real-world conditions. Moving on, let's look at segmentation results. The figures here illustrate how the method breaks a scene into segments at different scales, highlighting individual objects and their dynamic properties across multiple viewpoints. We also compare video to 4D generation across various models, focusing on a fair test where only anchored images and supervised learning are used. You can see how accurately each model reconstructs details and captures the complexities of scene motion. Our approach demonstrates an ability to adapt to different scales and maintain robustness. In this segment, we experiment with generative 4D Gaussian models. The setup uses videos that have frames from different viewpoints with random points initialized inside a sphere. Training runs for a set number of iterations. Other methods like cascade dynamic nerf and deform-GS are tested for comparison. We measure similarity and distortion scores, along with generation time. The 4D Gaussian Splatting model converges faster and delivers stronger quality metrics. Some other models struggle to converge under the same conditions, while Gaussian-based techniques remain stable. The training progress plots highlight how 4D Gaussian Splatting copes with irregularities in the reference views without breaking down. We now see how 4D Gaussian segmentation can decompose complex scenes into meaningful chunks. In the sear-stake example, we train compact 4D Gaussians on the sequence, then run a clustering algorithm like HDB scan. Similar features get grouped together, letting us identify distinct objects or parts of the scene. The cool part is how segmentation can adapt to the scale of interest. At finer scales, we might isolate tiny details, while at coarser scales, we capture broader elements in fewer clusters. This multi-granularity approach offers a flexible way to understand scene composition, whether you want a highly detailed breakdown or just a high-level overview. Wrapping it all up, the paper introduces 4D Gaussian splatting as a way to represent dynamic 3D scenes in a spatio-temporal volume. By using 4D primitives with anisotropic ellipses and spherical harmonics, it becomes easier to capture moving, changing scenes with realistic quality, and do it quickly. We've also seen how various compression and pruning strategies keep memory use in check, while special design choices like spherical harmonics and residual vector quantization help avoid overfitting. Across a range of tasks, new view synthesis, 4D generation, scene segmentation, 4D Gaussian splatting consistently shows strong results. That holds for both real-world and synthetic tests, suggesting it can be applied broadly. And that's it for our deep dive. Thanks for following along and exploring how 4D Gaussian splatting can handle the complexity of real-world, time-varying scenes. Hopefully, it sparks new ideas for building even more immersive 3D experiences.